Hello and welcome to The Print. I am Keshav Padmanabhan, a principal correspondent, and today we have with us Ujjal Dosanjh. Mr. Dosanjh, first elected to the Vancouver Kensington riding in 1991, became the first person of Indian origin to reach the highest office in the province in Canada, that of Premier of British Columbia in 2000 to 2001. Later was elected as a member of parliament for the riding of Vancouver South between 2004 and 2011. And he was also a former federal minister of health between 2004 and 2006. Mr. Dosanjh today is an author after retiring from the parliament in 2011. He originally was born in District Jalandhar in India before emigrating to Canada in his teens. Welcome, sir, to The Print.
Good to be with you.
Starting off with my first question, there is this perception, at least here in India, that Canada, especially under the present Trudeau regime, is or has been soft on pro-Khalistan separatism. There have been, for example, conversations here on how we look at the Anti-Terrorist Act in Canada and how there have been no prosecutions for that. But of course, this act was implemented post 9/11, well after the acts of the Kanishka bombing in 85 or the attack on the Punjab cabinet minister in 1986. But nevertheless, the lack of any sort of Khalistani separatist on this list or any sort of effective active action has led to this perception of soft on terrorism in India, sir. So I just want to understand from your experience, how has this developed? How has this perception of the soft on terrorism developed within Canada?
Well, I think that when the Air India happened, this act wasn't in its current form, and retroactively, perhaps it can't be applied. However, at that time, the police forces in Canada weren't familiar with the culture and the language of the community. They didn't have informants. They had to develop all that, and eventually took a long time. After bungling the investigation, took a long time to prosecute the Air India accused, and were unsuccessful in prosecuting. And I think the perception is created perhaps for Mr. Trudeau more so because Mr. Trudeau's supporters, many of them from the Indian community at the time of his leadership and after, have been those of Khalistani persuasion, and he has been known, or at least seen to be close to them, and therefore there may be a perception in India that somehow Canada is soft on Khalistani activities, violent Khalistani activities. I don't believe that's the case because I don't believe there's been an act of terror by Khalistanis recently that hasn't been prosecuted. I think the issue with Mr. Nijjar was more complex in the sense that he was accused of creating violence in India and perpetrating violence in India. And to my knowledge, no formal request for extradition had ever been received by Canada. There is a treaty, extradition treaty between India and Canada. I know a couple of people that have been extradited actually and are undergoing trial in India for committing crimes in India.
Right, sir. And I mean, I just want to build upon this perception game, right? At least in India, there's this perception that the Sikh minority of roughly about 770,000 people in Canada is an extremely important political swing vote, which is why, and speculation rife across media channels, that, Prime Minister Trudeau has to sort of seek those votes, and therefore he's soft on terror, right? Is this true, sir? Is this Sikh minority a very important political voting bloc? And is that why parties, or the perception that both the Conservatives and the Liberal Party have pandered to, a certain louder extremist voice within the minority?
I think that it's a little more sophisticated than that. I think the issue is that from the days of older Trudeau, late Prime Minister Trudeau, the current one's father, Indo-Canadians, Indians generally coming to this country have been very favorable to the Liberal Party, because Liberal Party was the one that opened the doors to larger immigration in the 60s when I came to Canada from England. And so that history is never forgotten by immigrants. I don't believe vast majority of the Sikhs vote on the basis of whether or not Mr. Trudeau supports or encourages Khalistan. I don't think he supports Khalistan. I mean, I know him. I was an MP with him for 3 years. But I think that where Mr. Trudeau has gone wrong, and I'm happy to say this, is that whenever he's confronted with this question of doing something about the Sikh separatists in this country, he takes refuge under the rubric of freedom of expression. And I think that's somewhat misleading. Yes, people have the right to have a freedom of expression, right to say they want Khalistan, but he has never gone to the extent of saying India is a friendly country, at least was until a few weeks ago, that India is a friendly country, a fellow democracy, perhaps faultier than our own, but it's a friendly democracy. It's a bit of an ally nowadays, and therefore we don't support the dismemberment of a fellow democracy and an ally. Nobody in Canada has said this, and I think that's where the problem is. Because once you said this, you take a leadership position on this issue and say, I don't really appreciate Canadians engaging in activities that disrupt our allies or fellow democracies. And that has never been said.
Yes, and just building on that as well, right? As someone who has faced violence, actual violence perpetrated on yourself by Khalistani supporters back in the 1980s, right? And there are innumerable cases of various individuals of Indian origin in Canada who face violence from this very, loud or vocal minority of extremists. Is it that there is an actual support base for this idea of pro-separatism, or is it because of intimidation or fear that individuals sort of end up, falling into supporting such loud voices?
I think what you're doing is you're misunderstanding silence for consent. Vast majority of the Sikhs don't support the idea of Khalistan, in Canada at least. But there is a significant minority, and they're loud, and sometimes they're violent, and other people who are simple immigrants, hardworking people, peace-loving, like all other people, simply go about their business of making a living, raising their children, and doing what you need to do to live in a country peacefully. So I think that sometimes what happens is the silent majority, the silence of the silent majority is mistakenly perceived as support for Khalistan. And I think that is something, like, I know thousands of people who tell me that. You talk to ordinary people here, they'll tell you that. But, it is not their business to fight against Khalistan. Like, you want them, India, in a sense, wishes that they would fight against Khalistan. But they are regular people, right? It's not their fight.
Yes, and I mean, I just want to, pick on that trend of this, the silent majority. And I think the journalist Terry Milewski in his book talks about this when Prime Minister Trudeau in 2010 came to Vancouver and, decided on who the candidate for the Vancouver South riding would be, right? Yeah. Decided to listen to the loud minority rather than the silent majority, given that you had been the sitting member of parliament from 2004, right? And accordingly, Milewski speculates that, he states that, a different candidate with connections to, certain separatist organizations was selected over the silent, moderate Sikh candidate, right? So, I mean, given that this kind of perception is there,
Well, he was indebted to them. because they signed up a lot of people at the temples in support of his leadership campaign. You gotta dance with the one that brung you to the party, and so it's wrong. I mean, what he did, I disagreed with what he did, because the other candidate was an accomplished business person, a philanthropist, an activist, who understood Canadian life, is well versed in terms of the Canadian reality. So I agree with Terry Molesky, but you can't sort of extrapolate one act to then explain everything else.
Yes, fair enough. I mean, I think extrapolation is a pitfall that sometimes we all fall into. Saying that, sir, I just wanted to go on Monday morning, after the bruising summer for the Liberals, Prime Minister Trudeau, in the floor of the Parliament, in about 15 seconds, undid over 2 decades of diplomatic statecraft to rebuild Indo-Canadian ties after the lows of the 1980s. It was 15 seconds when he made the statement using credible allegations, potentially linking the government of India. There was nothing about credible evidence. So this is a two-part question, sir. How do you think Prime Minister Trudeau should have, come out with this kind of information? And do you think the way he did it was right or wrong?
Well, to give credit to Mr. Trudeau, there is evidence that's now been made public in the newspapers that they have some communications and signals evidence from the Indian diplomats of some involvement. We're still not sure what that is. And my question is, if you have the evidence, why are the police still looking for the culprits? Because they're still searching. They haven't even identified them. But if I must say this, it saddens if India has done this to come across the boundaries of another country and cause his assassination. It saddens me both as an Indian and as a Canadian, because my idea of India is not that of a rogue nation that does these kind. Now, a lot of people raised a lot of questions when the U.S. went after Osama bin Laden in a third country. And so I think that, so having said that, I believe that Mr. Trudeau actually spent a huge amount of the capital that had been built up in terms of the Indo-Canadian relationship in those 15 minutes, and in the process damaged himself as perhaps the only interlocutor who could discuss with Prime Minister Modi and resolve these issues in a more amicable fashion. Not that those who may have done this go unpunished, but there are different ways of skinning a cat. And I think in that sense, he has now lost the ability to be effective interlocutor with India. He has to now find somebody else who might be more acceptable to India so that this can be resolved somehow, so that our relations aren't damaged irreparably.
Yes, sir. And just to add on to that, I just wanted to understand. I mean, there is this belief that by the Prime Minister standing on the floor of the House and speaking to the Canadians, that he has prejudiced the investigation, right? Because now it is up, or the belief is that it is now up to the RCMP to prove him right, right? How? I mean, is this true? Or they prove him wrong as well. But I mean, has this sort of impacted the integrity of an investigation? And as an Indian, should one now trust that the RCMP has got it right?
Well, it is rare. I have not seen it in living memory that police prosecutions or investigations here have ever been impacted by political influence. Canada's justice system and policing are, they're not the perfect. I mean, nobody's ever perfect, but they are. They have the capacity to function objectively, regardless of the political masters. Because in policing, the politicians never interfere. Never. And they're not allowed to. If there is any evidence that an attorney general would pick up the phone and call the police, that chap would have to resign immediately.
Right. I mean, but just saying, there has been, the SNC Lavalin case where at least the Prime Minister was alleged to pick up the call of the Attorney General, right?
And the Attorney General stood up.
Yes.
The system works.
Okay, fair enough. Which brings me to my sort of last question of the evening, sir. There has been a growing number of Indian origin members of parliament in Canada. In fact, I think Prime Minister Trudeau was extremely proud of the fact that he had more number of Indian origin minorities in his cabinet than India did, specifically Sikh cabinet members. But given this growing representation, right, how is it that there has been also, with the growing representation of this sort of silent majority, there has also been an amplification of separatist voices in the last few years? And how do we, try to unpack this?
Well, those two things aren't necessarily related, but I think there's been an amplification of the voices because there has been no voice on the other side. People like me who fought them in the 80s because we felt it was important to retain the credibility of our own community here. We needed to fight Khalistani violence in particular. They've kind of gone on to live their own lives. You can't continue to fight this. Those who are wedded to the idea of Khalistan, that's their life. So they have a cause that they live for. Whereas other people, 95% of them simply go on to make their lives, live their lives. As far as the members of parliament are concerned, I fault them for one thing. They rarely speak out against, spurious allegations made by Khalistanis or violent statements made by Khalistanis or violent floats taken out in processions like float for Indira Gandhi's murder in Brampton or AK-47 posters being paraded around in Surrey. They rarely, if ever, say anything on that issues. I fault them for that because if they did, I think the Khalistani minority may become slightly more silent, but they never do that, and that is for me, that's just political opportunism. And if you want to be extreme, you can say it's political cowardice.
Right. So that's my last question of the day. So once again, thank you, Mr. Dosanjh, for taking time out and speaking with The Print.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And good talking to you. And good meeting you.
Thank you, sir.